Today we are pleased to have with us the Reverend Ian Baxter. Ian lives in Wesham and he is in charge of the chaplaincy department at Blackpool Victoria Hospital. He was born in Edinburgh and studied theology in Birmingham, where he met his now wife Jill, who was also studying theology. They were married after completing their degrees, and Ian continued his training at Spurgeon's College in London. They were then called to a church in Great Eccleston, where they were for 8 years before Ian joined the chaplaincy team at Blackpool. They've got 3 children, Abigail, Zach and Naomi, and Abigail is due to get married in just a few days' time. Ian has been a chaplain for 14 years now, initially in a new role that combined working at both Trinity Hospice and Blackpool Victoria, and then just over a year ago he was appointed as the lead chaplain for the trust. Ian, thank you for finding time in your schedule to be interviewed. I realise that this must be a very busy time and quite a difficult time for you at the hospital. Now, before we come on to sort of how the virus has affected your work, tell us a little bit about your role at the hospital. What is it that you do?
Yeah, so we're here very much looking at patients' spiritual care and championing spiritual care throughout the hospital, really. So working as part of a team. There's a group of volunteers, a group of staff. So there's 3 of us whole-time, a couple of part-time, and that covers different denominations, religions, and then about 30 or 40 volunteers. And some of it's probably what you would assume we do. So bed-to-bed visiting, just calling around, visiting patients, following up on referrals. We do a 24/7 on-call service, calling in for sort of urgent matters and emergencies overnight. We're interested in staff support, so obviously we're looking after our staff as well and working with them. And then we do quite a bit of stuff behind the scenes that maybe people aren't so aware of. So we're on a lot of committees looking at trust policy and procedure, working around bereavement support and bereavement care, working with other staff, doing a lot of training, whether that's raising awareness around spiritual care, religious care, or just working with other teams to do joint training to show where we fit in with the wider hospital life. So yeah, it's quite diverse. Every day's totally different because you just don't know who you're going to meet and what's going to happen. And yeah, it's a very interesting, fascinating place to be working. Yeah.
Brilliant. So tell us, how has the virus changed things for you at the hospital? What's been different about your work?
Yeah, it is quite a big change. So early on, there was quite a dramatic change. All our volunteers couldn't come in anymore. And a couple of staff had to self-isolate as well. So we saw a big drop in what we were able to provide. And also just the way we work. So our visiting was quite quickly limited to just in terms of infection prevention, not going from ward to ward, not going from patient to patient, and having to wear the protective equipment is a big difference. So to have a conversation when you're wearing a mask is really challenging. And so, yeah, some quite big changes immediately. I would say definitely more complex needs as well. So less general visiting, but the patients we do see far more complex, having to support them, like I say, with the protective equipment, having to support them with relatives not being able to be there, just brought a lot of challenges. And we've certainly seen a lot of, a big increase in staff support. So a lot more staff coming into the chapel, coming into our offices, looking for support, wanting to talk, wanting to pray, wanting to just take some time out. We put tea and coffee in the chapel because staff just wanted to come and take a break. We put a lot of things like holding crosses and stones and prayers at the back of the chapel, and they were all taken very quickly. I think we had about 600 stones with faith, hope and love written on, and they've all just gone. A lot of engagement, more so than we've seen before. And we were just saying before, that's why I'm doing the interview. This is the coroner's office, because I couldn't get space in the chapel. I'd have loved to have sat in the chapel and have the nice windows behind me, but I've had to come into the coroner's office because there's so many people just popping in and out and coming to have to sit down. So it's lovely. But again, it's a big change to what we would normally do. And so I hope it's something we take forward, and that staff have seen that the chapel's more than just the space we use for our services. It is somewhere that people can come and take a few minutes just to be with themselves, to reflect, or to pray. So yeah, it's certainly a very different scene for us at the moment. Yeah.
I think we've seen that in community as well, because there's just been a huge influx of engagement with the church, and not just in Western and Kirkham and our areas, but across the country. You know, people, priests are reporting that we've just got this tremendous influx of people who are starting to ask questions about faith and starting to question their own faith, or I think it's interesting that that's happened during the crisis. And it's interesting, of course, that it's happening for you as well, on the sharp end, and that it's sort of happening to all of us. I love the fact that we can't do the interview in the chapel because the chapel is too busy. That's just such a good problem to have, isn't it? Let's face it.
It's lovely to see. Yeah.
So I guess in your role, you generally tend to meet people when they're experiencing the worst that life has to offer. You're sort of there for them at their crisis moments. And these situations, they tend to only happen to people maybe once or twice in a lifetime. But of course, you see it every single day with different families. How do you cope personally, and how does your team cope when you're faced with so much crisis on a daily basis?
So I get asked this a lot. A lot of staff will stop by and say, how can you do what you're doing? Because they assume it's quite intense, and it is. And we do see a lot of heartache and a lot of suffering. And there are lighter moments in there as well. So it does balance out. But you're right, we do juggle a lot. And I think that I was trying to make a note, and I wrote down all the things that I know I should say, but that I wanted to start by saying, actually, I do have really bad days where I just go home and I have real doubts myself about what's going on. It challenges my faith. A night where you don't sleep well because what you've seen is so tough. And I think it's right to say, actually, we have tough days. I can tell you things that help, but it's not always easy. And I think it's right to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that for our other staff as well. The things that do help is having a family, for me, a loving and supporting family. So I've got a place I can go, and that support, it's huge help to me. It's a part of sort of my motivation. I'm very proud of my children, and Jill's very supportive, and that is a huge help. I do enjoy being part of a team, so I'm not on my own, and that's partly I've got my chaplaincy colleagues around me, and we will often talk about the things we're having to deal with and debrief and have reflective practice, but it's also the wider team. So if I'm called into A&E, one of the things I'll do is I'll always try and stop and talk to the member staff I've been working with and just check in with them. And part of that wider team, you're working with the nurses, the doctors, working with the cleaners and the kitchen staff. And it's just nice sometimes to be able to stop and actually recognize you're part of a wider team. There are people pulling together, working together. And it does help when you're facing those challenges. And then obviously my faith as well. It's not where I started out. I think in church I had very set ideas. I thought I had an answer for everything, and everything was a bit sort of black and white. And then you come into chaplaincy, and I have to say it does open your eyes to having to live with the mysteries a bit more. And to me, that's deepened my faith by being able to say, actually, I don't have an answer to this. I don't know why this should happen to that particular person, why that younger person should be suffering. And sometimes actually it's quite liberating and deepening of your faith to walk away and say, actually, there's a mystery to this. I'm going to go and worship on Sunday, and I'm going to go and pray, and I'm going to sing, but I don't know why this is happening, and learning to live with that rather than trying to answer it every time. And I find that's deepened my faith in terms of my experience and my journey. And my faith does help me. And I do use opportunities to pray and to reflect, and try and work that into what I'm doing with my work. One of the toughest things is just knowing when to stop. So if your pager goes and you dash off to a ward, and then you think, oh, I must go and see so-and-so, and then I must go into so-and-so. And sometimes just knowing when to say, actually, I need to just stop. Just go back, take 10, 5 minutes, whatever it might be, before going on to the next thing, and pace it out. Because I found in church life, those gaps came quite naturally. There was a natural pace to the day. And then you come to the hospital and it's just a little bit more intense, and you've got to stop yourself getting drawn into one crisis following another. So there's a few things I know I should do, but like I say, I don't always get it right, and I need to put my hands up to that. There are tough days, so
yeah. I think that's really interesting, actually, to accept that we're human, and we don't always get it right, and whilst we should just be able to hand all of this over to God and move on. I don't think that you could do the job that we do, and I especially don't think you could work it in your role if you didn't have that pain, if you didn't feel other people's pain and didn't understand. And I think if you can just walk away from a crisis and not be affected by it, it's the time to stop doing the job, isn't it? Very much so, yes. I know that one of the things that we're hearing a lot in community is, of course, that families are not, or during this crisis, they haven't been able to be with loved ones, especially at the end of their life. And that's tough. It's one of the most natural things in the world, that is to want to be with somebody at the end. How have you found that in the hospital? What comfort could you give to families who are in community who've been through that?
It's been the biggest challenge for us as a department, and for the hospital, and for just that whole. I was talking to the management when they were making decisions about not having visitors coming in, and they were really pained at making that decision. They knew it was going to be tough for the families, for the patients, and it has been. It's been one of the trickiest things. I think when I've been involved myself, quite often I'm doing a lot of phoning. So I'll phone a relative before visiting and after visiting, and just checking in, and trying to relay something of what's happening on the ward, trying to reassure them, to describe the situation a little bit. And we've been using technology a lot more. So we've tried to set up, the wards have got iPads and phones so that we can try and set up calls to allow that sort of contact. And it is helpful, and it's very profound. And some of it's making me think, why didn't we do some of this before? When you've got a relative on the other side of the country who can't come, why shouldn't they dial in and be part of a moment of prayer or something, quiet reflection in the room? And so we've learned from that, but it has been very challenging. I've had a lot of very upset relatives on the phone. We are looking at, there are exceptions around end of life, so they are trying to allow for some visitors to be able to come in, but it's still very limited. And it is still a real challenge, I have to say. And again, I think we're living with some of that. We're living with the anger of it, and we're living with the frustration of it. And that is part of what we face today. And I think looking ahead to when the role of the church going forward, and the church is opening up, I think there's going to be a lot of need that the churches can meet. I think there's going to be a lot of people who've not been able to go to the hospital, to attend a funeral, to be at the bedside, whatever it might be. And there's a lot of sadness and grief. And I think there's a lot of anger and frustration as well. And I think there is a role for the church there going forward to support the many families really who've found this so challenging. Yeah.
I think that you're absolutely right. I think the ramifications of this are going to be felt for quite a number of years actually going forward. Very much so. And I think it's going to be, families haven't had the opportunity to say their goodbyes in a way that they would normally have been able to. And you're right, the church is going to have quite a big role to play in that. I'm glad that as we're starting to ease the restrictions, that we're able to do funerals in church going forward, and we're hoping in the next few weeks to start that. And I think even just that will make a tremendous difference. Especially to people who have attended church all of their life and then can't have a funeral in their church. It feels bizarre.
It is. It's very sad. One of our longest serving volunteers very sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago, and he was part of the chaplaincy team for 30 years. And it was so sad. We were able to, as friends, we were able to dial in and sort of watch the service remotely, but we couldn't attend. And it was really very sad. And we've been looking at what we might do as things open up in terms of memorial services, and maybe trying to give a touching point for people to come back in. But I do wonder if it's something that should be community-wide and not just hospitals. So not just a service in a hospital, but actually churches working together and saying we need to mark what's happened for people and give people a space to come back and to remember. So yeah, very difficult times in many ways. Yeah.
I think there's also a case for people who have recovered from the virus, who've been very poorly, maybe been in intensive care. I know there was something on the news this morning that said that they were talking about that people would be suffering from PTSD following on from having recovered from the illness. And I think that that's something as well we need to be able to provide space for people to reach out to God and be touched by God's love, and to allow him to heal, not just physically but emotionally as well going forward, because it has been a shock for a lot of people, any major illnesses. And so I think that the church has got a huge role to play in that, definitely, without a doubt.
And then you have those who've been in lockdown. We've got some who've been self-isolating and have still got perhaps a few weeks left, and for them to return, as it were, into the world, and when the churches are opening up, I think they will have their own story to tell as well, and we need to give space for people to tell that story.
Absolutely. So hospital chaplaincy, and in fact chaplaincy across the board, tends to come under scrutiny, with people asking sort of, why should taxpayers' money be spent in this way? How do you respond to that criticism?
Yeah, well, I think it's just recognise that the hospital are trying to deliver good holistic care. So it's caring for the whole person, and that's recognising that they have physical needs, but they also have psychological needs, social needs, and spiritual needs. And that's very much a nursing textbook understanding of, this is what we want to do. We want to deliver holistic care. So when the hospital are setting that as their standard, I think it's quite natural that they would look at how they address those spiritual needs. And I think it's right that chaplaincy and modern day chaplaincy is where they're looking to say that we want to address spiritual care. So it's not just religious, it's a bit broader than that. And we're not here to try and convert, or we're not taking advantage of people who are vulnerable. We're here to champion that good spiritual care, which is really about listening. It's letting people tell their story, and when that involves religion and faith, we meet that need. But when it might involve broader things around love and family and support, we can also do that. And I think it's good that the hospital are investing in and trying to say we deliver holistic care. It gives us an accountability as well. So in meeting that need, I'm accountable to my faith authority. So I'm a member of the Baptist Union, and I'm accountable to them, but I'm also accountable to the hospital trust. And I think that's helpful and important. So I meet their standards in what I'm doing and what our team are doing. And I think those standards and that accountability are good for us. And really, I think it'd be very sad if we tried to say the hospitals were places where we only did physical care. I think we'd very quickly slip into addressing people as patient numbers, bed numbers, knowing people by their diagnosis rather than identifying them by name, recognizing they have a story, and recognizing they need to be treated as a whole. And I think that's a very strong case to say that there should be a modern day chaplaincy that's engaged in the life of a hospital and a hospice that looks at that holistic care. And that would be my it's my reasoning, it's my rationale for why I'm involved in what I'm involved with, why I'm part of multidisciplinary teams, why I'm involved in training staff, because it's important to them that they deliver that holistic care. So I think that's where it come from. Yeah.
Brilliant. So let's move away from the hospital for a moment. Tell us something about your faith journey. How did you come to faith?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home, surrounded by faith and church, regularly at church. And then for me, there's been a bit of a balance. There were some very clear decision points, and then it's very much then become a part of a journey. So the decision points, we were part of a Brethren Gospel church. I went there, and to be honest, the preacher just put the fear of God into me, and I was absolutely petrified. And I remember making a prayer of commitment just out of fear, thinking, oh my goodness, what's going on?
That's proper Baptist preaching, that is.
That was really kind of, and I still look back to that, because I remember talking to my uncle after the service, and he took me aside and we said a prayer, and I still remember it. But I do look back and think, oh my goodness, I was just as a child coming to terms with it. But it did start a journey. And then I would say another key decision point in there was, as an older teen, making the decision to get baptized. And that was a very different decision. That wasn't about fear. It wasn't about, and it wasn't a negative thing in that sense. It was a very positive wanting to say that God is part of my life, and every decision I'm going to make now is very much in tune with wanting to follow God. And that was really significant, being baptized. I'm quite shy. I'm quite quiet. It was quite a big deal for me to get up and give a testimony before I was baptized. And I definitely look at that as a sort of key decision point, a key turning point. And from then it's been a journey. Like I say, I think there's been points, meeting Jill and getting married and having children, really profound moments. My whole journey of ordination, and then coming into chaplaincy. And I mentioned before, a sort of change and more of a willingness to accept some of the mysteries around faith, and matching that with quite a sort of conservative evangelical background. It's very much a journey. And yeah, that's where my faith journey is, really. That's where I am, and I'm still learning. There'll be something new today. Yeah.
So how did you know that God wanted you to move into sort of full-time ministry? What was, how did you become sure of that?
So well, I went to Cape Henry Hall in near Carnforth. I went there after school, and very much a year out, just trying to work out what I wanted to do. And I did have a sense of calling. I did think I wanted to go into some sort of full-time Christian service. Didn't really know what. And I had a piece about that, but when I spoke to people, a lot of people said, "Oh, you're very young," and that's been something I've heard a lot of for quite a long time. And so after that, I then went back and I worked in a care home for a while. I did some bits and pieces. I'm not sure I was necessarily very good at it, but I was trying to hear what people were saying, and I was trying not to sort of rush into things. But then I still had that sense of peace and that this is what I should be doing. So I then went to Birmingham to study theology, and I met Jill there, and that calling was still with me. But the thing that changed is people started validating it. People started coming alongside and recognizing that it was right. And I'm glad I waited. I'm glad that I just gave people time to work with me, and it's the right thing to do. I think we can often feel God speaking to us and we have a peace about something, but you do need the wisdom of the people around you, the church you're with, to be talking to you and testing things out with you. And it was definitely right to do that. I mean, the being young, that stuck with me for a long time. When I first started in First Church, I was still going in as a very young minister, but I had a senior minister there with me as a sort of a mentor and colleague, and it was good. And it was some really, again, for me, it's always just been about having that peace, and then just that testing with the people around you. And again, coming into chaplaincy, I had a real peace about it. I was looking at different opportunities. I'd done some volunteering. I'd worked as a school governor, and I was looking to volunteer in the hospital, and I'd been doing it for about 6 months, and an opportunity came up to work. And again, I just had a real peace about it. And then those around me saying, "Yes, this is right. We think you should do it." And just lovely how it's worked out, really.
Yeah, so somebody who was who'd been a priest for a very long time once told me that when you actually start to do what it is that God wants you to do, it will make you happy and it will give you peace.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's always been my experience, that when I'm in the right place that God wants me to be, you get that inner feeling, that peace within you, that this is, even when it can be actually quite a difficult situation that you're in, actually that it's right. Yeah, absolutely.
When I used to work when I started at the hospice, a lot of people would say to me, "How can you work somewhere that's all, it's so much about death and dying?" But actually, I did have that peace working there, and the hospice is about celebrating life, and there's something very important about just having that outlook and the way you approach the work there. And for me to be able to see that it was about celebrating life and to have a peace about it, again, it was just a real confirmation to me that actually I'm doing the right thing. I'm not overly carrying people's burdens and bringing that home with me. And I did find that very reassuring, which people can find odd, because it's difficult enough when you say you're a minister, but when you say you work in a hospice and a hospital, I mean, it just, the atmosphere at the parties go, you're the first to leave. It's just, Jill will drag me away and say, come on, let's go. It's not great. It's taken me a couple of years to own up to what I do to the neighbours. I started saying, well, I work at the hospital, and then I admitted I was also a minister. It takes a while. Yeah.
Fabulous. Now, as we've already mentioned, your eldest daughter is due to get married soon. Now, this has been a bit of a roller coaster, hasn't it? Because obviously, like many other families, you were told that they weren't allowed to get married. And then, what, a week ago, 5 days ago, we were told, oh yes, now you can get married. So how have you coped with that dreadful roller coaster of are we, aren't we, you know?
Yeah, it has been really tough. I mean, I think we've all got our stories of things that are happening during lockdown, and I know it's not just us, and there's many people in similar situation, but as a family, that's been our biggest issue. And Jill and Abigail in particular, I know they found it really tough just working through it. I have been fortunate myself because I've been at work and I've had that same routine that's kept me going, but I've been coming back into it, and it is, it's difficult. And I think we've just had to rethink what it is for them to get married. We've been forced to think it's not about cakes and flowers. All of that had to be cancelled. And it's come down to a sort of reassessing what it is to get married and focus on the real basics of it. So it is about a loving couple making a commitment before God. It's about having a sacred moment. And it's lovely that we're now working towards that, and it's kind of been reframed. I mean, one day we'll get the big family celebration, and we will try and make it as nice as possible and everything. We're working on that, but it's certainly been a tough journey, having to let go of so much. But then somehow in the midst of that, sort of working out what it is that's important in the midst of this. In some ways, you might have to re-interview me in about 6 months, because at the moment it's just all, we're in the midst of it. But I think that's where we're going with it. And yeah, it's certainly been a challenge. They've also been doing their degree. They get their degree results today. They moved house 2 days ago. It's been pretty full on, I have to say.
Absolutely. That's a lot of life changes all within a very short period of time, isn't it?
It is. And some of those we were planning for and we knew it was coming, but then obviously there's just been so much uncertainty, checking the news, wanting to find out what will happen, having to wait, not sure how many can be there. I mean, we were initially told there'd be 5, and to try and decide which 5 is really tricky. It looks like it'll be about 30 now, so that's much more, it's enough to invite the people you want to be there. And yeah.
Horrible decisions, aren't they? But I think, that actually is quite similar to the funeral ministry in quite a strange way, because it brings people right back to basics. Actually, what are we doing here? And like you say, the weddings, are we having a big party and a big white dress and a big cake and lots of flowers, which is brilliant, or are we getting married before God? And I think in a lot of ways it's brought people right back down to the basics of life. What is important about my life, and what's the most vital thing for me here? Because all the other stuff's been stripped away, hasn't it? I think, in a lot of ways, people are asking those questions around all sorts of areas of their life.
Absolutely. But
So,
thankfully, we're getting to the point where we're beginning to actually look forward to it. So we're getting to the point where the date's in the diary, and we're getting there.
Good. So when she gets married, are you going to be dad, or are you going to be priest, or are you going to be a bit of a both? What's your role going to be on the day?
I think I'm going to go pretty much for dad.
Mm-hmm.
I was tempted to be priest a few weeks ago and just drive up and marry them. Just probably totally illegal, but just sort of when we were all getting a bit stressed out. But no, I think I thought about it a lot, and they did talk about me doing the wedding, but I think I'm just going to go and be dad. I'm just going to, and to be a husband, and to be with my family. And the nice part of it is that they've connected in with the local church where they are. and actually that church want to be part of what they're doing, and it's nice to see that happening. And it's maybe part of the, for me, it's going to be part of the leaving and letting go and allowing that to happen. I will take part somehow. I'll do some sort of prayer or blessing, I think. I'm still trying to work out exactly what, but even that, I think I'll be doing it as dad. It'll be a biased prayer towards Abigail, and Jonathan will get a mention, but I'll work on it. I'll try and make sure that it's fair. But I know people do it differently. I had a good friend of mine who said, you know, he married his, did the wedding for his daughter, and you know, he said it was the greatest day of his life, you know, real privilege.
Yeah.
And you know, I was really in two minds, and I can see different ways of approaching it. But I think just where we're at the moment, for me, it's about being dad, and that's my approach.
Yeah. And I always say that, you know, God called me to be a priest, but he called me to be a wife and a mum first before he called me to be a priest. And they're just as important a callings. I know when I got married, both of my parents are ordained, and you know, my dad was dad, and he walked me down the aisle and gave me away, and you know, and mum sat on the big, you know, on the front row with a big hat and cried, because that's what she wanted to do as well. They did, like you, they did take a little bit of a part in the wedding, but it's strange having those dual roles, isn't it? You know, in that situation.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, what's your hopes for the church as we come out of lockdown? Life is going to be different, we all know this, but what's your hope for the future of the church, and what's your hope for the future of chaplaincy as we come out of lockdown?
I think, well, I touched on it before. I think that there's a massive role for the church and chaplaincy going forward. I think that the need's not going to stop just because we get to some sort of date where lockdown finishes, or they bring in a vaccine, or whatever it might be. That's not going to be the end of it. And I think there's huge need. So my hope is that the church and chaplaincy are there to meet that need. And that in the midst of being able to celebrate that we can all get back together, we don't forget that we're there to serve others. So I would say that. But I have seen an awful lot of kindness and generosity these last few weeks and months. And I would love to see that continue. One of the things with chaplaincy is people don't often talk about denominations in the same way. You go and see somebody at the bedside, and they'll quite quickly say, well, I go to that church, and I'll say I go to this church. And then very quickly we just get on and actually find out we have a lot in common. Yeah. And I hope we have an element of that we come back together and recognize what we have in common, recognize that we need to support each other and be there for each other. And that kindness and generosity, the people who've given things to the hospital, their time, given things to nurses, and that expressing their gratitude, you know, I'd love to see that in the church as well, that we take that kindness and generosity. I know there's been people in Weston who've been going out doing shopping for others and helping others out. And I just think to see that continue and for that to become a natural part of what we do, be a community, look out for each other, would be lovely. And like I say, not just insular, not just the regulars we know, but recognizing that those around us are really in need of help. So I think it's something around that. Chaplaincy going forward, I don't know. I think the whole hospital doesn't know what it's going to look like in another sort of 6 months' time, how much of what we've taken on board in terms of new practice will become the norm, and to what extent we'll revert back to older things. I just don't know. For me, we can't lose the personal bit. It's about working with each other, whether it's technology or whether it's face-to-face. We mustn't lose that. So, yeah.
Okay, so we've got some questions that we ask to everybody. The first one is, when you get to heaven, what's the first question that you're going to ask God?
Yeah, I had to think about these. I mean, this is as close as I'm going to get to Desert Island Discs. That's how I was thinking about it. But I did struggle with them a little bit. I think when I get to heaven, I think I will have a lot of questions. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of why questions, but I genuinely think I'll be in awe, and the questions will probably fade away. The thing that I might still have, though, is I am quite curious. There's a lot of things that you don't know a lot about that I'd love to find out more. I'd love to go and revisit and catch up with my grandparents and talk to them, and you know, that side of things, just meeting with family again. And then obviously, I've always been curious. You hear a lot about certain disciples and then not about others? Or there's certain characters in the Bible that just appear for a couple of sentences. I'd love to just sort of find out where they are and go and have a chat and meet them and just find out a bit more. You know, when you got somebody like Thaddeus and you're thinking, I remember I tried to do we had a Thaddeus group at college where we tried to champion him. We tried to say, you know, we need to think about these people who aren't spoken of very much. And it was really hard work because we knew nothing about him and it was a lot of silliness, really. But I'd love to go and think, well, who were you? You were there. You witnessed it all. You're part of the 12. What happened to you? I'd love to go and just find somebody like that and sit down and talk to them. But yeah, so it's a tough question, but I think that's the sort of thing I'd be thinking.
Brilliant. So what would you like to be remembered for?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I don't know. I don't know. I'd love to think that I'm making a difference with what I'm doing. I'd love to think that it's helpful. I don't really think I'm doing it to try and create a legacy, and I'm not sure how I'd want to be remembered. I know I'm very passionate about my family, and I hope they're very proud of what I do and things like that, but I'm not sure how to identify it. And because I started with the other question, I was thinking about the people we don't know much about in heaven, and I was just thinking, actually, I don't mind if people don't remember, because there's a bit of me wants to just say, I've done my bit, and I really hope it's made a difference, but I'm not looking for the limelight. I'll be happy to get to heaven and then maybe find out a bit more about what was going on behind the scenes. Because again, a lot of chaplaincy, you don't know. You meet someone for a week or a day, and you don't know what the rest of life story is. You don't know what difference you've made. So again, I'm learning to live with not knowing, and I've never sought the limelight. So yeah, sorry, that's not a very vague answer to your question.
All right.
That's where it took me in my thinking anyway. So, yeah.
So tell us, what's your favourite Bible passage and why?
Yeah, tough one again. I've gone for, I wrote it down, John 11:35, nice and simple. It says Jesus wept. And it's nice, easy, because I can remember it. And I'm really not good with some of the memory verses. But I've used it an awful lot in my work with we do contract funerals for people who can't afford funerals as part of our work here. Mm-hmm. And it's often a verse I go to, because in the midst of Jesus teaching around victory over death, so that verse comes in the middle of the story about Lazarus dying, mm-hmm. and Jesus goes and meets Mary and Martha, and he teaches them, he says, I'm the resurrection and the life, and there's a great teaching around death, and then he raises Lazarus from the dead, a great illustration of that victory over death. But in the midst of it all, Mary and Martha, they just come and they get really annoyed at Jesus. They said, well, if you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened. And they don't see the bigger picture. And I just think it's lovely that in the midst of that, it says that when Jesus sees their concern, that he weeps, and it just says Jesus wept. And I think we have a very compassionate God, you know, and we have the victory and we have the hope. But I just love the fact in that small verse that there's an element of, actually, you know what, we have a very compassionate God who knows what it is to draw alongside us, to weep with us. And that verse just, it stuck with me, really. So,
brilliant.
Nice and short, easy to remember.
So what's your favourite song or hymn and why?
I do like the hymns, I have to say. I miss it a little bit with chaplaincy. We don't do as much we do have services, but we don't do as much singing. Mm-hmm. And I do miss that. And I like the hymns. I like the older hymns, and I suspect it's probably, there's a little bit of memory. There's a little bit of going back to what I grew up with, familiar songs and hymns, very emotive. And music can be very powerful, I have to say. You're looking at the work we do again here. I've had patients who've asked for some music to be played at the bedside, and it's always been really moving to see how that can mean so much to people. That it's going to be really difficult to pick a hymn, but the one I was thinking about was When Peace Like a River attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. And it's a lovely hymn. It's nice to be sung congregationally. It's nice. It's reminding me of when people get together. And I just think sometimes, regardless of what's going on, to be able to say, I'm going to put it aside, I'm going to sing this, whether it's in the car, whether it's at church, I'm just going to sing out and declare that sense of praise and worship and know that with all that's going on, you know, it is well, I just think is really profound. But again, if we catch up in 6 months, it might be a different hymn. I'm wanting to sort of just hold the right to change it, because I do quite broad, do like quite a lot. Yeah. I saw a patient one.
Yeah, we'll give you the right that you can change your mind on that one.
That's
definitely.
Good. There was a chap once who asked me to sing at the bedside. He wanted me to sing, and I was thinking, oh, it'll be something like, I was very nervous. This is early on, and I was thinking I could probably go for it. Amazing Grace, I could probably do it. And then he said, I'd really like something by Elvis. And I was like, oh, okay. That's not what I expected you to say. And the nurse who was with me said, why don't we just get a CD? I think she could see I was really struggling. All good intentions, but it didn't really quite work out. But
brilliant. Oh, well, Ian, thank you so much for finding time in your schedule to be with us today.
No, lovely to catch up. It's good.
That's wonderful, absolutely wonderful, and thank you for talking to us.
Very well.
And we wish you all the best as you're, you know, fighting on the front line with you know, with the chaplaincy at Blackpool. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.